This is not a sensational phrase, but a reality discovered in the isolated corners of the Appalachian Mountains in 1967. It was then that local authorities, following complaints from concerned neighbors, entered an isolated property in McDowell County. The grandfather who kept his granddaughter and great-granddaughter as wives, the most incestuous lineage of Western Virginia. The case of the Blackwood family remains one of the most disturbing records of consanguineous union in American modern history, hidden between deep valleys and dense forests in one of the most impoverished regions of the United States. The family property was almost 2 hours from any urban center, with access only by a dirt road that became impassable during the rigorous winter months. This geographical isolation was merely the beginning of a much deeper separation between the Blackwoods and the rest of American society. On a cold October morning, local Sheriff Robert Tanner and 2 social workers arrived at the property after several complaints about strange-looking children, who were rarely seen except during the family's rare visits to the small town of Welsh to buy supplies. What they found challenged everything their minds could understand. Consisting of a visibly deteriorated wooden house and 3 small cabins around it, the property was home to 23 people in total, a surprising number considering the modest size of the buildings. The patriarch was Jeremiah Blackwood, then 76 years old. Their evasive answers raised the first suspicions when they were asked who the people living there were. Sheriff Tanner later reported in his official statement, "When I asked who that young woman was by his side, he answered without hesitation, 'This is Clara, my wife.' It was only when they insisted on the investigation that they discovered Clara was, in fact, his own granddaughter, born of the relationship between his son and his daughter. Subsequent investigations revealed that Jeremiah not only had a relationship with his granddaughter Clara but also with Abigail, his great-granddaughter, born from the relationship between Clara and Jeremiah himself. The Blackwood family tree had become so intertwined that geneticists who later studied the case had to develop new models to properly represent the relationships. Among the 23 inhabitants, 17 had obvious physical deformities, severe strabismus, disproportionate limbs, extremely limited cognitive capacity, and a number of other rare medical conditions that experts would later explain were direct consequences of generations of consanguineous crosses. Social workers noted that many of the younger children could barely form complete phrases, although some were between 10 and 15 years old. Many had an abnormal curvature of the spine and cleft palates, classic signs of genetic conditions resulting from the accumulation of harmful recessive genes. "The most disturbing thing," said Martha Collins, one of the social workers present, "was not just the physical conditions, but the complete system of isolation that Jeremiah had imposed. The children had never gone to school, had never received medical attention, and believed their way of life was the only possible one." The origins of the Blackwood family dated back to the early 1900s when William Blackwood, Jeremiah's father, settled in that region after leaving his community in Kentucky due to rumors about his relationship with his own sister. The chosen geographical isolation was not accidental, it was a protection against social and legal judgment. When Jeremiah took control of the property after his father's death in 1932, he deepened the isolation. Children were forbidden to talk to strangers, and any contact with the outside world was strictly controlled. He propagated among his descendants the belief that the outside world was dangerous and that only by remaining pure would they survive. Investigations discovered diaries maintained by Jeremiah that revealed his distorted vision. He believed he was creating a superior lineage through consanguineous marriages, a grotesque perversion of eugenic theories that circulated in the early 20th century in the United States. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You need to know these obscure stories that reveal the dark side of American society that history books try to hide. Each case brings to light truths that many would prefer to keep buried. The discovery of the Blackwood family was not just an isolated case of deviance but a disturbing reflection of practices that, although rarely discussed, existed in several isolated communities throughout the Appalachian during the 20th century. geographical isolation, extreme poverty, and a lack of education created conditions for consanguinity practices to persist even when they were already widely condemned by the larger society. Even more shocking was the fact that some residents of the region were aware of the situation but chose to ignore it under the pretext of respect for privacy, an accomplice silence that allowed the suffering of multiple generations. When authorities finally intervened, a complex operation began to evaluate each family member, determine the exact relationships between them, and plan the next steps for an intervention that respected the dignity of those people while interrupting the cycle of abuse. In the next chapter, we will see how the medical community reacted upon discovering the extent of the family's genetic problems, the challenges faced by the authorities to integrate these people into society, and the victims' early accounts of life within the Blackwood property. When the medical team from the University of Western Virginia arrived in McDowell County to examine members of the Blackwood family, Dr. Harold Richardson, a geneticist leading the team, was not prepared for what he would find. With more than 2 decades of experience with rare genetic diseases, he described the case as one of the most extreme examples of consanguineous depression ever documented in American medical literature. The initial exams revealed that 17 of the 23 family members had serious genetic conditions. Among the children, 8 had polydactyly, extra fingers on their hands or feet. 11 had microcephaly, a condition characterized by an abnormally small skull size and, consequently, brain size. Almost all showed some degree of intellectual disability, with IQs ranging from 40 to 70, well below the population average of 100. What we are seeing here is not just the result of a single inappropriate relationship but of continuous generations of consanguineous crosses, explained Dr. Richardson in his report. When close relatives have descendants, the likelihood of deleterious recessive genes manifesting increases dramatically. In the case of the Blackwoods, we are observing the cumulative result of at least 4 generations of consanguinity. Among the most serious cases was Timothy, a 9-year-old boy and son of Clara and Jeremiah, who suffered from a rare combination of congenital heart disease, intestinal atresia, and defects in his nervous system formation. His life expectancy, according to doctors, would not exceed 20 years, even with immediate medical intervention. Preliminary genetic analyses, still rudimentary by the standards of the time, indicated extremely high homozygosity, a technical term indicating the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents, clear evidence of close consanguinity. A particularly disturbing aspect was the mental health of the family members. In addition to cognitive limitations, many exhibited behavior suggesting severe psychiatric disorders. Subsequent studies would confirm that prolonged inbreeding not only increases the risk of physical deformities but also of psychiatric conditions, including schizophrenia and mood disorders. Mary Blackwood, one of Jeremiah's oldest daughters at 43 when discovered, had recurring episodes of catatonia and auditory hallucinations. She had spent all her life on the property and, according to reports from other family members, was kept isolated in one of the huts during her most serious episodes, never having received any medical treatment for her condition. The case of the Blackwood family represents not only a human tragedy but also provides us with priceless insights on the effects of prolonged consanguinity in human populations, observed Dr. Elizabeth Harlow, a geneticist who joined the research team. At a time when we were just starting to understand the mechanisms of heredity at the molecular level, the Blackwoods offered an unprecedented case study. The scientific implications of the case were huge. In 1967, molecular genetics was in its early days, and the mapping of the human genome was still a distant dream. Studies of the Blackwood family contributed significantly to the understanding of genetic inheritance mechanisms and the effects of inbreeding. A surprising aspect revealed by the studies was the presence of several rare mutations that, under normal conditions, would have been eliminated from the population through natural selection. In the Blackwood family, these mutations not only survived but multiplied due to repeated consanguineous crosses. It's as if we were watching a genetic experiment that has occurred over decades, commented Dr. Richardson. An experiment that no ethics committee would ever approve, but it provides us with data that we could not obtain otherwise. The case also raised deep ethical questions for the professionals involved. How to balance the scientific value of the data collected with respect for the dignity of the people involved. How to intervene to guarantee the well-being of the most vulnerable members of the family without imposing external cultural values in an insensitive way. An ethics committee was formed to oversee all aspects of the intervention and research, establishing protocols that would later influence how similar cases were treated throughout the country. For the children born from the union between Jeremiah and Clara, and later between Jeremiah and Abigail, the prospects were particularly dark. Their problems were not only physical or mental but also social and educational. None had received any form of formal education, and their social skills were severely limited by the isolation in which they had lived. These children are not only victims of genetic conditions but also of an imposed social isolation, noted Patricia Dawson, a social worker assigned to the case. They grew up believing that their situation was normal, that the outside world was hostile, and that they were not entitled to a different life. The challenges of integration were enormous. The younger children and adults would need not only intensive medical care but also a gradual process of socialization and education. The older ones, deeply rooted in Jeremiah's belief system, resisted interventions and often expressed the desire to return to the isolation of the property. Meanwhile, the local community reacted with a mixture of horror, compassion, and, in some cases, rejection. Some residents mobilized to offer help, while others expressed concern about the family's integration into the community. "It's not that we don't feel sorry for them," said a local resident who asked not to be identified. "But how can we explain to our children what happened? How can we include these people in our community knowing what they did?" Such reactions highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of the case, the need to balance the protection of victims with the accountability of perpetrators, especially in a context where the lines between victim and perpetrator were often blurred due to cognitive limitations and cultural isolation. In the next chapter, we will explore the legal and social aspects of the case, including the judgment of Jeremiah Blackwood and the challenges faced by the social assistance system in trying to find solutions for the family members. It was only after months of therapy and the gradual building of trust that members of the Blackwood family began to share their experiences. Clara, then 32, was the first to break the silence in a session with psychologist Dr. Margaret Wilson, who specialized in trauma. Her report, recorded with permission and later transcribed into the case records, offers a disturbing view of life within the Blackwood property. "I never knew another life," began Clara, her voice almost inaudible. "Since I can remember, Grandpa always said we were special, that the outside world would destroy us because they didn't understand our purity. When I started to be with him, at 13, he said it was our duty to preserve the family lineage, that it was what God wanted." The deep psychological conditioning was evident in each word. Clara had been raised without any exposure to social norms outside that distorted microcosm. Her mother, Sarah, was Jeremiah's daughter with his own daughter Elizabeth, making Clara simultaneously his granddaughter and great-granddaughter. He controlled everything. When we ate, when we slept, who we talked to. No one questioned Grandpa, Clara continued. When Abigail was born and started growing up, he said she would be his next wife, that it was the way to keep our family strong. I felt something was wrong, but there were no words for it. I didn't know there was another way of living. The reports of older children, such as Thomas, 14, and Rebecca, 12, were equally devastating. Both described a life of constant work on the property without access to education, healthcare, or any form of entertainment beyond the stories told by Jeremiah about the evil of the outside world. Grandpa said that in the city people would kill us if they found out who we were, said Thomas. That only he could protect us? When I asked why my fingers were different from his, he said it was a sign of our superiority, that we were the chosen ones. Psychological manipulation was just one of the control tools. Physical isolation was meticulously maintained. The property was surrounded by dense forest, and the children were taught from an early age to fear any stranger who might appear. The rare visits to town to buy supplies were rigidly controlled, with family members educated not to talk to anyone and to keep their heads down. He said doctors were the worst of all, explained Clara. That they would cut our heads open to study our special brains. So no one ever went to the doctor, even when we were really sick. Many of us died like that. My younger brother Michael died of a high fever when I was 10 years old. Grandpa said he was too weak for our lineage. Educational deprivation was another form of control. Jeremiah only allowed his descendants to learn the basics of reading and arithmetic, taught by himself or by older members of the family. Any book not approved by him was forbidden, and the children grew up with an extremely limited understanding of the world. He had some old books, especially a Bible he read his own way, said Mary, one of Jeremiah's oldest daughters. He said that God spoke to Abraham about preserving his lineage and that we were doing the same thing. That bad people had distorted God's words to prevent families like ours. The distortion of religious texts to justify abusive behavior is a common pattern in isolated communities that practice consanguinity. Jeremiah had created his own interpretation of religion, mixing elements of fundamentalist Christianity with distorted eugenic ideas circulating in the early 20th century. One of the most impactful moments during the interviews came when Abigail, then 16, was finally able to express her feelings. As a product of the union between Jeremiah and his granddaughter Clara, Abigail suffered from various genetic conditions, including a severe form of scoliosis and moderate intellectual deficiency. I always knew I was different, she said, struggling to form complete phrases. The other children, they could run. I couldn't. Grandpa said I was his most precious jewel. That one day our children would be the purest of all. I didn't want to, but I was afraid of him. We all were. If you're listening to this story and feel your heart squeeze with indignation, leave the phrase in the comments, "No one deserves to grow up in the silence of abuse." Your voice is important so that stories like these do not remain hidden in the shadows. The Blackwood case has raised deep questions about how our society treats its isolated communities and how collective silence can allow systematic abuse to continue for generations. Martha Collins, one of the social workers assigned to the case, reflected on this collective failure in her 1969 interview with the Charleston Gazette. The question that continues to haunt me is not how Jeremiah Blackwood managed to do what he did, but how we all allowed it to happen for so long. There were signs, there were rumors, there were opportunities for intervention. But we chose not to see, not to listen, not to speak. And in that silence, generations suffered. The therapeutic intervention for the members of the Blackwood family was complex and unprecedented. There were no specific protocols for treating victims of generational abuse and prolonged consanguinity. The multidisciplinary team had to develop new approaches, considering not only psychological trauma but also cognitive limitations and profound cultural conditioning. For the younger children who were still able to adapt, the transition was difficult but promising. For the adults, especially those who had spent decades under Jeremiah's control, the process was significantly more challenging. It's like completely reprogramming someone's worldview, explained Dr. Wilson. We're asking these people not only to process their trauma but to reconstruct their whole understanding of what it means to be a family, what is appropriate, what is normal. It is a process that will take years, perhaps decades. In the next chapter, we will examine Jeremiah Blackwood's trial and the complex question of how justice can be applied in a case where the perpetrator created such a complete system of isolation and control that it blurred the traditional lines of legal guilt. The trial of Jeremiah Blackwood began in March 1968 at the McDowell County Court and quickly became one of the most complex and sensational court cases in the history of Western Virginia. The accusations against him were numerous: multiple counts of an inappropriate relationship with minors, deprivation of necessary medical care, forced isolation, and neglect resulting in death. District Prosecutor William Hayes faced an unprecedented challenge: how to build a case against a man who had created his own isolated microcosm where the rules and values of the wider society simply did not exist to its inhabitants, how to balance the need for justice with the understanding that Jeremiah, now 77, was himself the product of generations of isolation and possibly a bearer of cognitive limitations resulting from consanguinity. The defense, led by public lawyer Thomas Green, adopted a controversial strategy, arguing that Jeremiah did not have the mental capacity to understand the criminal nature of his actions. Preliminary psychological tests indicated he had an IQ of approximately 65, classified as a mild to moderate intellectual deficiency. "My client lived his whole life within a value system transmitted by his own father," Green argued in his opening statement. "He does not have the ability to distinguish between what his isolated community considered acceptable and what the broader society defines as criminal. Condemning him would be like judging someone from a completely alien culture by the standards of our own." This argument caused intense reactions both in the courtroom and in the media coverage of the case. The Charleston Gazette published an editorial condemning what it called dangerous moral relativism, arguing that some actions are so fundamentally wrong that they transcend cultural barriers. During the trial, the testimony of experts became central. Anthropologists, psychologists, geneticists, and social workers were called to help the jury understand the complexity of the case. Dr. Richardson, the geneticist who had examined the family, explained how generations of consanguinity had affected not only physical health but potentially also the cognitive capacity and moral development of Jeremiah and his descendants. "We are facing a case where the accused is simultaneously perpetrator and victim," witnessed Dr. Wilson. "His actions caused unquestionable harm. But he himself was created in a system where these actions were normalized, and his ability to make independent moral judgments was compromised both by socialization and possibly by neurological limitations." The most dramatic moment of the trial occurred when Clara was called to witness. There were doubts about her ability to face Jeremiah in court, but she insisted on speaking. Her testimony, delivered in an almost inaudible voice that occasionally broke into sobs, silenced the courtroom. "I didn't know there was another way to live," she said, avoiding looking directly at Jeremiah. "But I always knew that there was something wrong in the way we felt. The constant fear, the shame when we went to the city and people looked at us. Part of me believed we were special," as he said. Another part always knew we were trapped. When asked if she blamed Jeremiah, Clara hesitated for a long time before answering. "He did what his father did before him. He didn't know another way. But that doesn't mean he should have continued. Someone had to interrupt the cycle." Clara's testimony exemplified the moral complexity of the case. Even the most direct victims of Jeremiah's abuses recognized the historical and social context that had shaped his actions, though it did not acquit him. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Jeremiah Blackwood was found guilty of most accusations, but with mitigating circumstances related to his limited mental capacity. Judge Clarence Morris then faced the difficult task of determining the sentence. "This court recognizes that no punishment can remedy the damage already caused," said Judge Morris. "We also recognize the exceptional circumstances of this case, including the defendant's advanced age and his cognitive limitations. However, the severity of the acts committed requires a response from justice." Jeremiah was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment, to be served in a state medical institution where he could receive appropriate care for his age and conditions.
The sentence was widely seen as symbolic, as it was unlikely he would survive for many years considering his weakened health. The Blackwood case established important legal precedents related to mental capacity, cultural isolation, and criminal liability. It stimulated debates on how the judicial system should address cases where cultural, genetic, and psychological factors intertwine in complex ways. Most importantly, the judgment brought national attention to the issue of isolated communities in the Appalachian and the potential dangers of extreme social isolation. Social assistance programs throughout the mountainous region were revised and strengthened, with new guidelines to identify and intervene in similar situations before they reached such proportions. For the Blackwood family, the verdict marked the beginning of a new phase. With Jeremiah permanently removed, the focus changed to the rehabilitation and integration of the surviving members. The property was sold, and the funds were placed in a trust administered by the state to finance the necessary ongoing care. In the next and last chapter, we will explore the fate of the Blackwood family members in the following decades, the scientific advances that came from the study of their case, and the broader lessons American society has extracted from this tragic history. Almost 6 decades have passed since the discovery of the Blackwood family, and their lives followed dramatically different paths after the authorities' intervention. The fate of each member reflects not only their personal circumstances but also the limitations and progress of the American social assistance system during this period. Jeremiah Blackwood passed away in 1972, just 4 years after his judgment, from heart complications at the state medical institution where he served his sentence. According to reports from the medical team, he maintained until his last days the belief that he had been unfairly punished for preserving the purity of his lineage. His case has been studied extensively by forensic psychiatrists, contributing to a better understanding of how extreme isolation and inbreeding can affect moral and cognitive development. Clara, who had demonstrated remarkable resilience during the trial, faced a long battle to rebuild her life. Initially under intensive care at a state institution, she gradually developed basic social and educational skills. In 1975, with social services assistance, she managed to move to a supervised community environment where she began working in a protected workshop for people with special needs. Clara's case represents both the limits and the possibilities of human recovery, observed Dr. Wilson, who continued to follow her progress for over 2 decades. She will never be completely free from the effects of her past, but she has developed a life with dignity and even some joy, something that seemed impossible when we first knew her. In 1983, Clara gave a rare interview to a documentary filmmaker producing a special on isolated communities of the Appalachian. Her perspective had evolved significantly. "I spent a lot of time angry," she said. "Not just at Jeremiah, but at all those who knew and did nothing. The world that made us invisible for so long. Now I understand that getting stuck in anger is another form of prison. I learned to live one day at a time, finding little joys. It's more than I ever thought possible." For Abigail and the younger children, the path was equally challenging but with some additional possibilities. As they had been discovered at a younger age, they were able to receive earlier educational and therapeutic intervention. Abigail, who suffered from severe scoliosis, underwent multiple corrective surgeries funded by a special program created after the national attention generated by the case. At age 20, she had completed an adapted educational program and began working as an assistant at an elderly care center. In a letter written to Dr. Wilson in 1989, she reflected on her journey. "Sometimes I still have nightmares about the old house in the mountains. But when I wake up, I look out the window and see normal people living their lives. And I know I've found my place. I will never have the life I could have had if I had been born in different circumstances. But I have a life that is mine, and that is more than I ever dreamed possible." Long-term follow-up studies of the Blackwood family members provided valuable insights for geneticists, psychologists, and social workers. From the 1980s, with the advancement of genetic analysis techniques, researchers were able to more accurately identify the specific mutations that had accumulated along the generations of consanguinity. Dr. Lawrence Peterson, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University who studied collected samples from the Blackwood family in the 1990s, published an influential article in Science magazine detailing how certain rare recessive mutations had manifested at extraordinary frequencies in the family lineage. The Blackwood case remains one of the clearest examples of the effects of extreme homozygosity on human populations, wrote Dr. Peterson. The analyses performed in the 1960s and 1970s were limited by the technologies available at the time. Today we can precisely identify the genetic mechanisms involved, which allows us not only to better understand this specific case but also to develop more effective interventions for rare genetic conditions in general. One of the most significant aspects of the Blackwood legacy was its impact on social assistance and child protection policies. The case showed grave failures in the system for monitoring isolated communities and led to significant reforms in how government agencies approached at-risk families. In 1974, partly in response to cases like the Blackwoods, the U.S. Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, which established national standards for the identification and intervention in cases of neglect and abuse. Extreme isolation came to be recognized as a potential form of neglect requiring investigation. Before the Blackwood case, there was a significant reluctance to intervene in what was considered private family affairs, especially in isolated rural communities, explained Robert Tanner, the sheriff who participated in the initial discovery and later became an active advocate for reforms in child protection policies. The case forced us to recognize that isolation can be a tool of abuse and that family privacy cannot serve as a shield for severely harmful practices. The broader social effects of the case were also significant. In the decades following the discovery, educational programs on the genetic risks of consanguinity were implemented in rural schools across the country, especially in traditionally isolated regions like the Appalachian. The initial media coverage of the case was often sensational, with headlines that dehumanized the family and reinforced stereotypes about rural Appalachian communities. However, more nuanced reports began to emerge, exploring the social, economic, and historical factors that contributed to the extreme isolation of families like the Blackwoods. In 1987, journalist Elizabeth Harrer published The Silent Mountains, an investigative book that contextualized the Blackwood case within the wider history of economic abandonment and social isolation in Appalachian communities. The book argued that while Jeremiah's actions were undeniably abusive, the broader social system shared responsibility for allowing such a situation to persist for so long. The mountains of the Appalachian, with their deep valleys and isolated communities, became a convenient place for America to forget, Harper wrote. When cases like the Blackwoods emerge, there is horror and indignation, but rarely a recognition of how decades of institutional neglect and systematic impoverishment have created the conditions for such extreme isolation. For mental health professionals who work directly with the family members, the case also offered valuable lessons on trauma and recovery. Dr. Wilson, in her retirement lecture at the University of Western Virginia in 1998, reflected on these lessons. What we have learned from the Blackwood family challenges our conventional understanding of human resilience. We have seen individuals who have suffered almost unimaginable deprivations develop capabilities for connection, adaptation, and even joy. It is not a simple story of overcoming. Many continue to face significant challenges, but it is a powerful reminder that even in the most adverse circumstances, there is potential for growth and change. Thomas, one of the younger children who was only 14 when the family was discovered, perhaps represents the most remarkable example of adaptation. After years of special education and intensive care, he was able to overcome many of his initial limitations. In 1985, he completed a technical course in carpentry and eventually opened his own furniture restoration workshop, becoming a respected member of his community. In an interview with a local newspaper in 1992,
he reflected on his journey. Carrying the name Blackwood was not easy. For a long time, I tried to hide who I was, where I came from. But I realized that my story, however difficult, is part of who I am. Not all family members manage to adapt so well. Mary, who suffered from severe psychiatric conditions, spent most of her adulthood in long-term care institutions, with alternating periods of stability and crisis. Some of the youngest members, who had the most serious intellectual deficiencies, remained in assisted care environments, unable to live independently. The history of the Blackwoods is, in many ways, a window into an obscure chapter of American history, a reminder of the consequences of extreme isolation and social neglect. It is also a testimony to the human capacity for change and adaptation, even after deeply traumatic experiences. In 2017, 50 years after the initial discovery, the University of Western Virginia organized a multidisciplinary symposium entitled Lessons from the Appalachian: Isolation, Intervention, and Ethics. The event brought together geneticists, social workers, anthropologists, ethics experts, and health professionals to discuss the legacy of the Blackwood case and similar cases. What makes the Blackwood case so important, even half a century later, is that it forces us to confront fundamental issues about autonomy, community responsibility, and the limits of state intervention, observed Dr. Rebecca Johnson, a medical ethics expert and one of the symposium's organizers. At the same time, it reminds us of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us, especially when they are hidden by geographies of isolation. The last surviving members of the Blackwood family today live discreetly. Many have changed their names to escape the stigma associated with the case. Clara died in 2010 at the age of 75, having spent her last years in a support community for the elderly in Charleston. Her obituary, brief but dignified, mentioned her love for gardening and her kindness to everyone she knew, a testament to her ability to create a significant life beyond her traumatic past. The place where the Blackwood property once existed is now covered by the rapidly growing forest, with few physical traces remaining. In 2005, a small memorial was established in McDowell County, not specifically mentioning the Blackwoods, but honoring those who suffered silently in the shadows of our mountains and those who worked to bring light to these dark places. The story of the most consanguineous family of Western Virginia remains a powerful reminder of human fragility and resilience, the devastating consequences of extreme isolation, and the responsibility we all share to protect the most vulnerable among us. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel." Be sure to leave your like and share this video with friends and family who are interested in real stories that reveal obscure aspects of American history. And remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigations into historical cases of isolated communities and their devastating consequences. Together we can bring to light these stories that need to be told so that they are not repeated.